two choices for women: the personal, the traditional sphere of women, their suffering, their self-image. On the other hand, the political, the renunciation of home and family to produce images dedicated to social change. Frida Kahlo and Tina Modotti both provoke and defy such neat categorization. The Mexican Renaissance was the progeny of the Mexican Revolution. The overthrow of the Ancien Régime of Porfirio Diaz in 1911 unleashed uncontrollable forces and counterforces for nearly a decade of civil war, peasant rising, and landlord oppression. It was a period of mingled cruelty, surprise, and hope, in which great masses traveled through Mexico in military campaigns, and many millions died. Others survived to march in triumph through the capital, to cheer a man on horseback, to wreak vengeance on the defeated, or simply thank their luck or cunning. Yet out of the turbulence of the Mexican Revolution arose a new renaissance of culture. Intellectuals and artists left the academies to rediscover and revalue the vivid traditional culture of their country, still inseparable from the daily life of marketplace and village square. More than once, Frida Kahlo portrayed herself as an infant, the issue of a family tree set against the landscape of Mexico. Her mother was a native Mexican, her father a photographer, an immigrant from Germany. She captured the intensity and ambivalence of her marriage to Diego Rivera in an ironic double portrait, and when she lent her house to Trotsky in his exile, she gave him a portrait of herself wearing the popular Mexican costume she loved. In The Two Fridas, she painted her own double identity, the European Frida in white and the American Frida in traditional dress. Yet the duality she felt in herself and in Mexico also offered the hope of a new hybrid, a new synthesis of cultural and personal opposites. She identified herself with this vision of Mexico. In My Nurse and I, the Indian nurse suckles the European child. In her painting Roots, she portrayed herself stretched out on the Pedregal, the volcanic rock of Mexico, joined to it by an intricate web of tendrils and branches. She used the popular art of Mexico as a model for her own paintings, remembrances of the dead, and especially ex-voto paintings, graphic depictions of disaster, painted on sheets of tin to be nailed up in church. In her own ex-voto painting, she substituted the figure of Marx for that of a Catholic saint, and showed herself as the victim miraculously cured. Like Mexican artists of the period, Tina Modotti was fascinated by the forms of popular culture. With Weston, she made a series of photographs of folk art to illustrate a book on Mexican culture, Idols Behind Altars. She also took photographs of marionettes, in which she looked especially at the hands of the puppeteer, the tracery of the wires, and the patterns of shadows, to show the manual dexterity of the work. At the same time, Tina Modotti turned towards scenes of modern life and industry. She made another series of photographs for a book of avant-garde poetry by an estridentista poet, petrol tanks, construction work, telephone wires. In these photographs, she moves close to international constructivism, with its emphasis on the urban and the world of the engineer and the labourer. Tina Modotti absorbed Edward Weston's aesthetic, his photographic purism, and developed it so that formal concerns could coexist with a commitment to social and political content. Tina Modotti chose political imagery for what it signified: the contrast between elegance and poverty, the misery of the urban poor, photographed with a heavy view camera, in an emblematic rather than a documentary style. She made formal compositions from elements which already had a symbolic significance, using the emblems of the Mexican Revolution, or of international communism, the hammer and sickle. Tina Modotti was born in Udine, in northern Italy, in 1896. Her father was a skilled worker and a socialist, forced, like many other Italians of the period, to go abroad to find work. While Tina was still a child, he emigrated to San Francisco, where his family later joined him. Tina worked there in a textile factory before she moved to Los Angeles in her early 20s.
There she became an actress in Hollywood films. In 1922, Tina visited Mexico and soon returned there with Edward Weston, the photographer. She lived in Mexico for the next 8 years. She traveled through the country working as a photographer, recording the life of its people, especially the women of Tehuantepec in the south. But in 1930, she was expelled from Mexico for political reasons, soon after the assassination of her companion, Julio Mailla, founder of the Cuban Communist Party, who was shot dead in the street by her side. From Rotterdam, she made her way to Germany, picking up the threads of her photographic and political contacts. But soon the threat of fascism forced her to leave Berlin, and she made her way to Moscow, where she abandoned photography for full-time political work. The Communist International sent her to Paris, and then, shortly before the outbreak of the Civil War, to Spain, where she stayed throughout the war, till the Republican defeat drove her once more into exile. Finally, she returned for the last time to Mexico, planning to take up photography again, and died there unexpectedly in 1942. Frida Kahlo was born, died, and spent much of her life within these walls. The Kahlo family home in Coyoacan, on the outskirts of Mexico City, known as the Blue House. Frida Kahlo's roots are here, in this house and garden. The walls are painted in traditional Mexican colors. The pyramid and the pre-Columbian statues celebrate the Indian culture of Mexico, before the Spanish conquest in the 16th century. At the same time, the walls form a protective shield, a shell or mask, covering Frida's life and its pain. It was here she sheltered from the storms of her relationship with Diego Rivera, who she married, divorced, and remarried. When she was a teenager, Frida had a terrible motor accident, leaving her crippled, in pain, and unable to have children. She decorated not only her home, often with images of death, but even the surgical corset that protected her broken body. Everywhere she surrounded herself with objects of art and folk culture, crude and brightly colored images, drawn from the imagination and complex culture of the Mexican people, identifying herself with them. Masquerade both shows and hides. Through the mask of her art, Frida Kahlo concealed and exposed her own pain, her physical suffering and her emotional suffering. Living and working at the time of the Mexican mural movement, she took herself as the main subject matter of her art and painted her own image and her interior experiences, dreams and fantasies. She painted her husband, Diego Rivera, in a medallion on her forehead, seeking an image for her inward thoughts as well as her outward appearance. Her fascination with her own interior life attracted in turn the fascination of the European surrealists. She painted her Moses after reading Freud's Moses and Monotheism, and when André Breton had visited Mexico, she made her painting, What the Water Gave Me, for a surrealist exhibition.
Frida Kahlo painted the passions of the unconscious. The world of dreams is a world of great beauty, but it takes her to the edge of terror. The haven of private fantasy is stripped of reassurance. She first began to paint as a teenager, when she was bedridden after a terrible road accident. Her spine was fractured, her pelvis shattered, and her foot crushed. For long periods of her life she was in pain and forced back into hospital for an endless series of operations. Painting brought pleasure, hope, and power over herself. She could ward off despair and regain control over her crushed and broken body by creating a masquerade of beauty. Whatever the degree of pain implied, by tears or even wounds, her face remained severe and expressionless, with an unflinching gaze. Yet at the same time, the severity is softened by a luxurious surround of lace or plants, or by an accompanying doll or spider monkey. Even here, though, there is an ambivalence. The wide-eyed monkeys somehow remind us of the missing child, the pain of desire. The stormy political life of her adopted country absorbed the energies of Tina Modotti, both as a militant and as an artist. She used her camera to record the activities of its people in public exterior space, at work, at meetings, or demonstrations. She looked at the hands rather than the face, and saw formal patterns as well as political commitment in the crowds in the street. In time, she developed a style which was both highly geometrical and highly political, a mode of photography through which she could register the 20th century with 20th century eyes. Tina Modotti had learnt photography from Edward Weston. She was his model, his apprentice, and finally his colleague. From him she learnt to look for the beauty in ordinary objects, and to insist on clarity and precision in order to bring out the geometry which was normally overlooked. The trained and sensitive eye could see formal compositions and textures of light and shade in the most simple subjects: flowers, plants, human figures, the outlines of buildings. This was the aesthetic legacy that Tina Modotti inherited from Edward Weston. Frida Kahlo was unable to have the child she desired and suffered a series of miscarriages and medical abortions. She displays her pain and her damaged body through the traditional iconography of Catholic art, the depiction of martyrdom and of the Passion. In Henry Ford Hospital, her body on the bed is surrounded by emblematic objects, like those which surround the crucified Christ in an allegory of redemption. These images of her own agony have an archaic, almost medieval aspect, a love of minute detail, often based on anatomy textbooks, a disparity between foreground figure and background setting, a disregard for proportion and perspective, the use of conventional signs and attributes. In a self-portrait of herself with her doctor, Dr. Farrell, she paints the palette itself as a bleeding heart, both the surgeon's heart and that of the mystic. Her appeal is not to an imaginary identification with herself as subjected to pain, but to a symbolic reading of her body as the site of suffering, as in The Little Deer, which combines Catholic imagery with a metaphor taken from a popular song. In her self-portrait with cropped hair, she quotes another song. "Look, if I loved you, it was for your hair. Now your hair's gone, I love you no more." In her still lives, fruit became part of the body, flesh-like, as though she was dismembered before her own eyes. Even the rays of the sun are incorporated in the web. Volcanic barrenness contrasts with images of cosmic and natural vitality. Frida Kahlo turns everything into a language of signs, through which the traumas of injury and their effects are written in allegory and emblem. Tina Modotti's choice of Tehuana women as subject was also, in its way, political. The women of Tehuantepec in the southwest of Mexico were legendary for their strength, beauty, and independence. Tina Modotti was made famous as a beauty in Hollywood films and as a model for Edward Weston and Diego Rivera. Beauty was inscribed on her body by the look of others. When she herself learned photography and could return that look, she chose as her models, as her subjects, women whose beauty was inseparable from their work and their independence. Tina Modotti wrote to Edward Weston, "I could not possibly see what prettiness had to do with the revolutionary movement." Often she photographed mothers with small children, their bodies framed to emphasize not their own form, but their interaction with the children. They're shown in the process of mothering, that is to say, at work. The camera position is often below head height, to show the labor involved in mothering, and to avoid the isolation and fetishism of the pose for a camera. At the same time, she reveals the curves of pregnancy and the diagonals of the arms to bring out the formal values of each scene. Tina Modotti mainly photographed women, and her gaze is direct and just. Two choices for women: the personal, the traditional sphere of women, their suffering, their self-image. On the other hand, the political, the renunciation of home and family to produce images dedicated to social change. Frida Kahlo and Tina Modotti both provoke and defy such neat categorization. Frida's fascination with her own body and her national culture was deeply political. Tina's photography is strongly marked by her personal experience as a woman. The energy that each found to combat both personal calamity and political oppression survives in their art. We still feel it today.